When a regime starts blaming foreign enemies for domestic collapse, it's usually because it has already lost the ground beneath its feet. I spent enough years in intelligence to recognize the most dangerous lie we tell ourselves, and it is not spoken loudly. It is whispered in briefings, footnoted in assessments, and reinforced through repetition until it becomes accepted truth. In the case of Iran, that lie has been stability. For years, U.S. intelligence and policymakers have treated the Iranian regime as brittle but enduring, coercive but ultimately in control. That assumption was not grounded in hard intelligence. It was a narrative convenience built to justify sanctions policies, avoid escalation, and preserve the illusion that pressure alone could manage a revolutionary state in long-term economic freefall. The warning signs were never hidden. Iran's currency collapse, recurring labor strikes, protests spreading beyond urban elites, and the visible erosion of regime legitimacy among merchants, students, and even security families were all observable, verifiable facts. Yet intelligence reporting repeatedly framed these indicators as episodic unrest rather than systemic decay. Analysts were encouraged implicitly and sometimes explicitly to emphasize regime resilience over fragility. When protests erupted, the focus shifted to suppression capacity, not political exhaustion. That is not intelligence analysis. That is risk avoidance disguised as caution. Recent events stripped that illusion bare. Demonstrations erupted across dozens of Iranian cities, including Tehran's Grand Bazaar, a historic barometer of regime confidence. Security forces responded with lethal force, detaining over 1,000 people and killing dozens, according to human rights organizations. When a regime fires tear gas in its own economic heart and deploys mass arrests to restore order, that is not stability. That is a system burning political capital it cannot replenish. The deeper failure was not missing the protests. It was failing to integrate them into strategic assessment. Intelligence agencies treated unrest as background noise while policymakers spoke publicly about deterrence, negotiations, and managed escalation. Meanwhile, Iran's leadership openly blamed foreign enemies, conducted air defense drills, and prepared for external conflict as a means of internal consolidation. These are classic indicators of a regime under stress, seeking survival through confrontation. Any junior analyst with historical literacy should recognize that pattern. The strategic consequence is predictable. When intelligence minimizes internal decay, policymakers misjudge timing, thresholds, and response options. They are surprised not because events were unforeseeable, but because uncomfortable assessments were filtered out before reaching decision makers. Iran is not suddenly unstable. It has been deteriorating in plain sight. The illusion of stability delayed preparation, distorted messaging, and narrowed options. In intelligence, that is not a mistake. It is a failure of institutional honesty. I learned early in my intelligence career that economics is never a secondary indicator in regime stability analysis. It is the bloodstream. When it slows, pressure builds everywhere else. In Iran's case, the economic warning signals were not subtle, and they were not disputed. The national currency lost massive value over time, inflation hollowed out wages, basic goods became unstable in price and availability, and sanctions compounded long-standing structural corruption. None of this required clandestine collection. It was visible in open data, street behavior, and regime rhetoric. Yet, U.S. intelligence assessments consistently treated Iran's economic collapse as a pressure tool rather than a destabilizing force with its own momentum. The distortion began with intent. Sanctions were framed as leverage, not as a destabilizer that could push a brittle system toward internal rupture. Intelligence reporting followed that framing. Analysts focused on whether sanctions were working in coercing policy changes, not on how prolonged economic stress was eroding the regime's internal cohesion. When protests broke out over food prices, fuel costs, or unpaid wages, they were categorized as economic grievances divorced from political legitimacy. That separation is artificial. In authoritarian systems, economic failure is political failure. because the social contract is transactional, not ideological. What was ignored was the compounding effect. Iran's economy was not just shrinking, it was fragmenting. Black markets expanded, elites insulated themselves, and regional disparities widened. The merchant class, traditionally cautious and pragmatic, began aligning openly with protesters. That should have set off alarms. Historically, when bizarre networks withdraw consent, regimes lose their shock absorbers. Instead, intelligence summaries emphasize the regime's ability to deploy security forces as if coercion could substitute indefinitely for solvency. This misreading had direct strategic consequences. Policymakers assumed time-favored pressure. In reality, time-favored volatility. Economic collapse narrowed Tehran's options and increased the incentive to externalize crisis through confrontation. A regime that cannot stabilize prices or employment looks outward for enemies and inward for scapegoats. That is not speculation. It is a recurring pattern across sanctioned states. Yet intelligence products soften this conclusion to avoid appearing alarmist or politically inconvenient. The hardest lesson here is institutional. Intelligence failed not because it lacked data, but because it lacked permission to connect the dots honestly. Economic indicators were reported, but their implications were diluted. Strategic warnings were buried under cautious language. The result was a policy community that believed Iran could absorb unlimited pressure without losing control. That belief was never grounded in reality. When economic signals are ignored or reframed to support policy narratives, intelligence stops being a warning system and becomes a justification engine. By the time unrest erupts nationwide, the assessment cycle is already behind events. One of the most corrosive shifts I witnessed over my career was the gradual replacement of intelligence analysis with narrative management. It did not happen through a single directive or overt censorship. It emerged through incentives, career risk, and the quiet understanding that certain conclusions were unwelcome. Iran became a textbook case. Rather than asking what the regime was becoming under sustained pressure, Washington focused on how events could be framed to preserve diplomatic flexibility, alliance cohesion, and domestic political messaging. Intelligence did not disappear. It was curated. This distortion was visible in how protests were described. Language mattered. Demonstrations were labeled localized, economically motivated, or short-term flare-ups, even as they spread across dozens of cities and cut through class, ethnic, and occupational lines. Analysts who emphasize scale, persistence, and regime anxiety found their assessments softened in final products. The objective was not accuracy, it was manageability. Policymakers wanted space to maneuver, and intelligence was reshaped to provide it. Public messaging and classified assessment began to mirror each other instead of diverge. That is a red flag. When intelligence aligns too neatly with official statements, it usually means dissent has been filtered out upstream. In Iran's case, this meant downplaying signs of elite fracture, overstretch within internal security forces, and the psychological impact of repeated protest cycles. Regime survival was treated as a default condition rather than a variable under stress. The deeper failure was strategic imagination. Narrative management assumes continuity. It assumes that today's constraints will look like tomorrow's. Intelligence is supposed to challenge that assumption. Instead, assessments reinforce the belief that escalation could be calibrated indefinitely, that internal repression would remain effective, and that external threats could be deterred through signaling alone. Meanwhile, Iranian leadership rhetoric hardened, military drills intensified, and blame shifted aggressively toward foreign adversaries. These were not theatrics. They were indicators of a regime preparing for worst-case scenarios while Washington reassured itself publicly. The consequence of narrative-driven analysis is loss of credibility. Allies watch the gap between words and events. Adversaries test boundaries. Internal actors, including Iranian protesters and security personnel, measure whether U.S. statements align with observable behavior. When they do not, deterrence erodes. Intelligence should illuminate these gaps. Instead, it was used to paper over them. The hard lesson is uncomfortable but necessary. When intelligence organizations prioritize narrative coherence over analytical integrity, they become participants in self-deception. Iran's internal crisis was not misread because it was complex. It was misread because acknowledging its trajectory would have forced difficult policy choices. Intelligence exists to surface those choices, not to delay them. Once analysis becomes an extension of messaging, surprise is no longer accidental. It is engineered. Every intelligence officer eventually learns that unrest follows patterns, and that those patterns include thresholds beyond which containment becomes exponentially harder. Iran crossed that threshold, and the warning signs were unmistakable. What changed was not the existence of protests, but their persistence, geographic spread, and social composition. Demonstrations moved from episodic expressions of anger to sustained acts of defiance. They appeared in provincial cities, industrial zones, and symbolic economic centers. They drew in merchants, transport workers, and families of security personnel. At that point, unrest stops being a policing problem and becomes a strategic one. U.S. intelligence failed to treat that transition with the seriousness it demanded. Reporting continued to frame events as cyclical disturbances rather than as cumulative stress. Each protest wave was assessed in isolation, stripped of historical context and trend analysis. That is analytically indefensible. In authoritarian systems, repeated unrest erodes fear faster than any single uprising. The regime's reliance on force becomes more visible, more costly, and less effective over time. Intelligence should have flagged that shift clearly and early. Instead, assessments leaned heavily on the regime's capacity for repression. Analysts cited force levels, arrest numbers, and crowd control tactics as indicators of control. That logic confuses capability with legitimacy. A state can disperse a crowd and still lose authority. When lethal force becomes routine, it signals weakness, not strength. Iranian security services were burning through morale, cohesion, and public tolerance to restore temporary calm. That is not a sustainable equilibrium, and history offers no examples where it ends well. The strategic consequence of missing the protest threshold is miscalculation. Policymakers assume they have time. They believe pressure can be adjusted incrementally. Meanwhile, regime leaders perceive existential risk and narrow their decision space accordingly. That gap in perception is dangerous. Tehran began preparing for external confrontation not because it wanted war, but because internal instability made deterrent signaling essential for regime survival. Intelligence that fails to connect internal unrest to external risk produces policy blind spots. The analytical breakdown here is institutional. Intelligence organizations are optimized to track events, not trajectories. They measure what is happening, not where it is going. In Iran's case, trajectory mattered more than any single data point. Sustained unrest, economic desperation, and narrative exhaustion converged into a legitimacy crisis. That convergence crossed a threshold long before Washington acknowledged it. The hard lesson is simple and unforgiving. Regimes rarely collapse without warning. They collapse after warnings are normalized. Iran's internal crisis followed a recognizable pattern, and intelligence professionals should have said so plainly. When thresholds are ignored, surprise is guaranteed. Not because intelligence lacked information, but because it lacked the courage to state the obvious. When a regime begins to lose confidence in its ability to manage internal dissent, it almost always turns outward. I have seen this pattern repeatedly, and Iran followed it with precision. Internal instability narrows strategic options and elevates military signaling as a substitute for political legitimacy. What U.S. intelligence failed to acknowledge openly was that Tehran's external posture was no longer driven primarily by deterrence or regional ambition. It was driven by fear. As protests intensified and repression escalated, the regime increasingly framed internal unrest as foreign aggression, preparing its population psychologically for confrontation beyond its borders. This shift was observable. Iranian leadership rhetoric hardened. explicitly blaming the United States and Israel for domestic unrest. Air defense drills intensified, missile units were placed on alert, and military exercises were publicized aggressively. These actions were dismissed in Washington as routine signaling or domestic theater. That interpretation ignored context. Militarization during internal crisis is not about capability demonstration, it is about survival messaging. The regime needed to unify fractured internal audiences by externalizing threat and justifying repression as national defense. Intelligence assessments treated these military movements as compartmentalized developments separate from protest dynamics. That analytical separation was a mistake. Internal legitimacy crises and external escalation risks are inseparable in revolutionary systems. When a government believes it is under siege from within, it assumes it is vulnerable from without. Preparations for conflict become both a deterrent and a warning to internal actors that dissent will be equated with treason. This is not speculation, it is doctrinal behavior. The strategic consequence of misreading this militarization was complacency. Policymakers believed escalation could be managed through calibrated messaging and back channels. They assumed Tehran would avoid confrontation to preserve regime survival. In reality, the opposite logic was emerging. Demonstrating willingness to confront external enemies became a way to restore internal cohesion and intimidate dissenters. That raised the risk of miscalculation dramatically. The analytical breakdown here was a failure to integrate psychological drivers into military assessment. Intelligence focused on hardware, readiness levels, and force posture while ignoring why those signals were being sent at that moment. Military movements divorced from political context tell only half the story. In Iran's case, they were not signs of confidence, they were signs of narrowing choices. The hard lesson is unavoidable. When internal crisis becomes militarized, warning time shrinks, decision-making compresses. Leaders under pressure act faster, communicate less, and accept higher risk. Intelligence organizations are supposed to flag that compression clearly. Instead, they treated Iran's actions as predictable, controllable, and familiar. History shows that crises become most dangerous precisely when they appear routine. Iran was not preparing for war because it wanted one. It was preparing because it feared losing control. That distinction matters, and ignoring it carries consequences. Credibility is not built through statements. It is built through consistency between assessment, messaging, and action. Once those diverge, credibility erodes quickly, and in Iran's case, that erosion was visible to every relevant actor. Allies watched U.S. rhetoric remain cautious while events on the ground accelerated. Adversaries tested boundaries, uncertain whether warnings were policy or performance. Most importantly, internal Iranian audiences measured American resolve against observable behavior and found it lacking. Intelligence should have warned that this credibility gap was widening. Instead, it became part of the gap. The problem began with overconfidence in deterrent signaling. Policymakers believed carefully calibrated language could shape Tehran's behavior without committing to escalation. Intelligence assessments reinforced that belief by emphasizing controllability and restraint. Meanwhile, Iranian leadership interpreted ambiguity as hesitation. When warnings were issued without immediate consequence, they were discounted. Deterrence does not fail suddenly, it decays. And once it does, restoring it becomes far more costly. U.S. Intelligence also underestimated how credibility functions in authoritarian systems under stress. Regimes in crisis do not weigh signals the way stable governments do. They look for proof of intent, not nuance. Public statements without action are read as weakness, especially when internal survival is at stake. Intelligence reporting should have highlighted that asymmetry clearly. Instead, it relied on Western assumptions about rational signaling and escalation management. The credibility collapse extended beyond Tehran. Regional allies adjusted their own calculations, preparing for volatility rather than relying on American foresight. Protest movements inside Iran drew conclusions about the limits of external support. Security forces assessed whether international consequences would follow repression. In each case, uncertainty favored the regime, not because it was strong, but because its opponents could not count on consistent external pressure. The analytical breakdown was systemic. Intelligence organizations treated credibility as a policy outcome rather than an intelligence variable. They measured statements, not perception. They tracked declarations, not belief. In reality, credibility exists only in the minds of observers, and those observers were signaling doubt. That doubt should have been elevated, not minimized. The hard lesson here is stark. Once credibility erodes, options narrow. Deterrence requires belief, and belief requires alignment between words and analysis. Iran's leadership acted with increasing confidence that Washington would hesitate. That confidence did not emerge overnight. It was cultivated through repeated mismatches between intelligence warning and political response. When credibility collapses, crises accelerate. Intelligence's role is to prevent that collapse by telling uncomfortable truths early. In this case, it did not. There is a persistent myth in Washington that crises erupt without warning, that events suddenly spiral beyond control despite careful management. That myth survives because it absolves institutions of responsibility. In reality, strategic collapse is almost always preceded by ignored indicators, softened assessments, and deferred decisions. Iran's trajectory fits that pattern precisely. What comes next is not unknowable. It is merely inconvenient to acknowledge. Regime crises follow recognizable stages. Economic decay erodes legitimacy. Repression substitutes for consent. Protests persist and spread. Internal threats are externalized. Military signaling intensifies. Credibility gaps widen. Decision-making compresses. Iran has moved through each of these stages in sequence. Intelligence professionals should be able to map them in their sleep. The failure was not analytical capacity, but institutional will. Warnings were diluted to preserve policy flexibility, and by doing so, intelligence surrendered its primary function. What follows such a trajectory is rarely linear. Regimes under pressure do not reform gradually. They either reassert control through overwhelming force or fracture under the weight of their own contradictions. Both paths carry regional consequences. External confrontation becomes more likely, not because leaders are reckless, but because they perceive narrowing survival options. In Iran's case, internal instability has already altered its risk calculus. That reality will shape its behavior more than any public statement or diplomatic gesture. For the United States, the lesson is not about Iran alone. It is about the collapse of the American strategic narrative itself. For years, policymakers believed they could manage outcomes through pressure, messaging, and calibrated restraint, while ignoring structural decay inside adversary states. Intelligence was reshaped to support that belief rather than challenge it. The result is a pattern of surprise that is entirely self-inflicted. The most damaging consequence is not any single crisis, but the erosion of analytical honesty. When intelligence organizations learn to anticipate political preferences instead of strategic reality, they stop functioning as early warning systems. They become narrative maintenance units. That transformation is subtle, gradual, and devastating. It ensures that when crises accelerate, leaders will claim they had no warning, even as the record shows otherwise. What comes next in Iran will not arrive without indicators. It will emerge from the same forces already in motion. Whether the outcome is intensified repression, regional escalation, or regime fracture, it will follow known patterns. Intelligence cannot control those outcomes. It can only illuminate them. When it fails to do even that, strategic collapse is not an accident. It is the logical end state of self-deception. The hard lesson is the one institutions resist most. Intelligence exists to tell leaders what they do not want to hear before events make the truth undeniable. When intelligence becomes fiction, reality intervenes, and it always does